welcome, guys. I have to say, at Helium, I feel like I was always the dumbest person in the room, which is certainly true. Here on this panel, I feel like I'm the dumbest person on the panel, which is also true. So you guys are very lucky that I'll be asking questions, which I hope it relates to everyone here, common questions that I've heard, both in our community Discord around 5G, and other things around, what does 5G really mean, and how hard is it? How practical could this be for us to really bring 5G cell towers, which today, very complicated stack, not just hardware, but the software itself, and how folks on stage with me here really have innovated to bring that accessibility to everyday folks, not just technical people, but everyday folks. I think that's a journey that we're going to take to get there eventually. So before we start, why don't we just do a quick round of introduction, maybe your name and what company you're with, and your favorite flavor of ice cream, because it's so hot. Start at the end.
I'm Izzo Wayne. Been working in the telecom space for the past 18 years. I work for GigSky. I'm head of products. But GigSky is a global travel SIM company that has a bilateral agreement with hundreds of operators around the world. And we're the first to launch, actually, essentially the first mobile plan on Helium today. Yeah.
Your ice cream?
Ice cream, vanilla. There you go.
All right. Yeah, Jesse Rosh, CTO for the North America of Bicells. Yeah, we initially launched actually back 2015, 2016, and with selling mostly small cells designed for small operators. So we kind of led in kind of the space where this is going with the distributed model. But yeah, making the pricing available to everyone and minimizing the solution and the technology necessary to build your own network. We feel we kind of pioneered and took over that space from back then in preparation for CBRS to launch. And then, it turned out that Helium was kind of the perfect model for making this really to the average consumer, making it deployable. And then have been working with the Freedom Fi team to help make that happen when it comes to the neutral host capabilities and connecting to the MNO networks. But yeah, ice cream, I guess, chocolate chip cookie dough.
All right, hey everyone, I'm Stephen Leotis. I am from Mosa Labs. I'm one of the co-founders. We actually just publicly launched on Thursday. That doesn't mean we're brand new to the space. We're actually backed by a company called Sercom, who's been building small cells for 15 plus years. So the co-founders, we are part of this company that is trying to bring these products that have been more traditionally B2B and bringing them directly to the consumer. So what we're going to do is, we're going to build the Helium 5G infrastructure, the small cell products, the gateway products. We're also going to build solutions so you can actually use the network. And I think that's one of the things we'll talk about today. How can you use the network beyond the traditional, put your SIM card in your cell phone? What other innovative use cases can we create? And so we'll talk about that more today. My favorite ice cream is pistachio.
So Boris Rensky, Freedom Fi. I'm curious how many of you know what Freedom Fi is. Can you raise your hand? Oh. Yeah, well, actually, very few. I'm surprised. So we actually were, I would like to say, very early on, working very close with the Helium team, kind of figuring out what the Helium 5G journey would look like. My personal background is open source cloud infrastructure. And at the moment when we actually came across Helium, we were focusing on basically kind of consumerizing and simplifying deployments of small-scale networks, cellular networks in the CBRS band. So today, what we do is we build this box called the Freedom Fi Gateway, which there is an example of there. But this is not really kind of bread and butter for the company. The bread and butter is just the software that goes in the box and working with various partners across the Helium ecosystem, like most of the folks that are sitting here, enabling them to actually, deploy Helium 5G. So high level, this is the intro.
Thank
And the ice cream. I don't really like ice cream. I used to, but I'm getting fat, so like I'm trying to not to like. I've taught
Fair.
myself not to like ice cream at this point.
Wow, that's very impressive. Very impressive. I love chocolate ice cream, so if anyone wants to get me one, please, I can use that right now. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate you being here with us in the community. I think just to level set, because I think folks here from different walks of life, different levels of technical understanding, and certainly online, you get diversity of folks who are really interested in how this all works. Maybe we could start with just some basics. Like today, how does a telecommunication company establish connectivity? Like how hard is that? I don't want to get too deep into the rabbit hole here, but perhaps contrast that with sort of your perspective of how it should go for them in the home. Like why is this going to work, and why is this going to be so different than the difficulty it is today for the way in which telecommunications roll out cellular networks? 5G is a great example. Like I feel like 5G as a word has become more of a marketing word versus technical. And I feel like 5G has been something that the entire telecommunications community has been talking about for maybe almost 10 years now. And why is it still not here? So maybe talk about the difficulties. You want to start?
Sure. I can actually share some insight there in terms of having worked at AT&T, which is a large telecom operator with its own infrastructure, but also working at GigSky, which is a virtual network operator that doesn't have any infrastructure. For GigSky today, GigSky has to have bilateral agreements with operators around the world to leverage their infrastructure. So at the end of the day, what's the most important element in a network, mobile network, is the SIM card that allows the device to connect to the network. GigSky has its own SIM card, but when the device arrives at a certain location, the device needs to connect to a tower that might be owned by another network operator. So therefore, GigSky has to have agreement in place with that. Now, the most important thing, and we're in our business, it's a commodity business, it's about price. Today in the US, we buy 1 gigabyte for $4. When we heard about Helium and 50 cents a gig, we're like, oh my God, this is great, we need to do this, we need to be the first to do it. Now, when you think about, from an AT&T standpoint, a large operator has infrastructure, it costs a lot of money, they need to get licenses that cost billions of dollars. Now with CBRS, with Helium, what they're saying is an opportunity to really reduce CapEx. We really call this zero CapEx model. It completely is going to change the telecom space. A lot of big operators right now are looking at it from afar. This is very intriguing. They have a lot of requirements they want to put in place. But from, I guess, in summary to your question, it really depends on the profile of the network operator. But it's very hard whether you're a virtual network operator or a large telco, established telco, to deploy network in general. And I think with Helium, it's really reshaping the whole industry and making it more easier for operators to deploy.
Yeah, I think, yes, I could add. So it really wasn't long ago, a traditional cellular carrier network, you would need hundreds of thousands just to get started. You have the core, the EPC portion of it. And there's very few vendors out there that were providing, so one was like there's just not many vendors out there, and they're typically used to dealing with the carrier market, so it's priced at a certain point. It wasn't priced for some small operator, let alone consumer, to build a network with it. So that was a big key. So when we launched, we tried to solve that by doing a cloud-based EPC, and so basically, we made it so you wouldn't need to buy a core at all. There was no core you had to invest in. You just had to buy the radio, plug it in, and then there's some automation there to get it connected back to the core. But this was a way to kind of kickstart the market and make it so a lot of the small ISPs, because that's kind of who we targeted initially when we came to US, is we found that there really wasn't any vendors. I think there was maybe Telrad at the time that was really the only one pushing like a solution that you could maybe buy under 20K. So if you could buy a small cell for a few thousand or whatever, and that's really all you need to do, you just plug it in and get it going, then great. And that works for private networks really well. But the biggest thing that can make this whole distributed model work, I think, is CBRS really, because you need license, you need spectrum. That not long ago, there wasn't any spectrum. You had to be spend tens of millions of billions, in a lot of the spectrum. So that was the big thing. So now that there's spectrum available, that's not the typical like unlicensed like 2.4 or 5 gigahertz or now 6 gigahertz. The cellular networks don't operate in those bands, and those bands are very congested and noisy. So CBRS had a good middle, I think, ground of we'll provide some licensed use, we'll share it with the incumbents, and then there's still like an unlicensed component to it, but it still has to register at the SAS. You still have to get granted and permission to transmit, and the SAS has a better ability to mitigate interference that way. But really, without that spectrum and without the growing ecosystem to make all these devices affordable, it probably would not have, cellular probably would not be a thing, at least at this point, like where we're at today.
Yeah, so Jesse, just to clarify, tell the audience what an EPC is.
Oh, sorry.
What's an EPC?
So the EPC is the packet core. So this is, and this is the LTE terminology, right? For 4G. But the core network is the anchor point for all of your radios and for your internet connection, essentially. So in a carrier network, it's a little different from Wi-Fi, where all the traffic leaving your Wi-Fi device, your AP, it's all transmitting on the network as you would expect. But there's a tunnel that's established between the radios and the core. So in the solution we have right now, today, that tunnel is like directly connected to the gateway. So the FreedomFi gateway is essentially the core. And the open source piece of it is also why this is working, right? Because you can mitigate that cost of spending, even though the cost of cores and the different vendors are out there, you can buy cores for a few grand now, but that's still a lot of money. Sure. That would not work if every gateway costs several $1,000s. So the open sourceness of it and what FreedomFi really put together is also the big key of making.
You also
this
use
work.
an acronym SAS.
Yeah.
What does it stand for?
Okay, so SAS is so in the CBRS world, the SAS is what's approving the spectrum access system. So every CBSD device, so this is any device that talks to SAS, we call a CBSD, and that device has to get permission, right, authorization. So when you plug in this kit, the solution, basically the radio cannot go active until it's signed by a CPI, which then gets approved by the SAS. And then as far as the CPI, I did hear this question a lot, so maybe I'll help answer that too. But there's a lot of question about, I'm not a CPI, how can I install this radio?
What's a CPI?
And the CPI is a certified professional installer.
There we go.
Now, don't pay attention to the words of CPI because it's not really what it is. The CPI essentially is signing. It's authorizing that the install parameters that were entered for this radio is accurate and correct.
Okay.
Because to become a CPI, you have to take this test. It's approved by certain bodies, approved by the FCC. But so the CPI is going to be the person that's signing off, saying, okay, this installation is correct, because ultimately, if there's anything wrong with that install, they become liable.
So let's pause there, because I've heard a lot of problems here. It's very complicated, right? We heard capital expense. So nationwide networks would be billions of dollars, I'm guessing, right? License fees, I heard that as well. Sounds like there's lots of layers of regulation. Maybe it's FCC, maybe it's some other entities that have to coordinate. So there's license fees involved. You introduced the core. I'm trying to remember all this. EPC and something called an orchestrator, like a SAS, to make sure things are going the way it should. And then you need a special installer that has the license to do all this, because they were educated on this.
Right, but to add on that really quick, the CPI does not have to be the person who actually physically installs radio. So even though it's called Certified Professional Installer, anyone here can take an indoor-outdoor radio, install it, and then I know FreedomFi has a certain process and an app where you're basically verifying all the install information, right? You're taking a picture of it, you're saying the azimuth is pointed in this direction. The GPS will kind of like grab some of the other information. But when you install the radio, there's a certain procedure. And then that goes, not to speak on FreedomFi's behalf, but that will go to their
Got it.
design,
So to put simply, all right, you need lots of money. You need to have some government approval. which to
Okay.
me sounds like the DMV, which sucks probably. No offense to the government. And then you need like a degree in some education to understand how to put all this together and get it installed. So okay, that's pretty complicated, all right? Because I don't think I can understand more than
We
that.
didn't cover hardly anything.
No, that's just scratching. That's scratching the surface. But this helps sort of paint the picture of why infrastructure is so expensive. It's not. It is rocket science. It's not sort of trivial, which we wish it would be. Maybe it can be. So let's pivot now and have you two address. Well, how do we do this at everyone's home? Like, how's that possible?
So before we go there, I wanted to also say another thing. So first of all, Jesse is like one of those unique personalities of which there's maybe like 5 people in the industry exist. Jesse's one, I'm the second, probably. That actually have some level of understanding of how the cellular wireless stack works. And this kind of, relates as to why I think Helium and decentralized model is also so good for 5G. So the thing with cellular is that, and folks here have mentioned before, is that it all kind of historically been built in a very bottoms-up fashion because you have to buy, spend billions of dollars of spectrum. So typically, there is like a handful of MNOs in any country that were able to buy the spectrum. And these are large companies. So because this is how it is, typically everything is kind of built in these like layers that are isolated from each other. So there's people that know everything about a radio, or even not a radio itself, but like a small component of a radio. There is a person that knows everything about like one specific component of a core. There's a person that knows how to, do like RF planning. And if you go to like, if you look at the whole thing altogether, there isn't anybody who understands how the whole thing works end to end. These people generally are very, very few. And it's not just about the complexity, it's about lack of the sort of understanding in the system of how to get rid of that complexity. And this is to a large extent, I think, why there's been so much talk about like 5G and small cell deployments and all of this stuff. But very little has happened because in the telco world so far, telcos operate like in this complexity building macro towers where you spend $20, $30, $50,000 deploying one tower, and you have 7 types of engineers that know one specific thing just deploying that one tower. When you try to deploy a small cell, it doesn't make sense to have 7 people actually do the same thing because the small cell is not nearly by definition as powerful. And typically, when we're talking about 5G, most people think of 5G as a millimeter wave, which doesn't go far. So you need to have like a lot of very cheap small cells installed in a very kind of like plug-and-play fashion. And not just because of how complex it is, but because of how the industry historically evolved, this was like an impossible task. So I think that Jesse's team has done an enormous amount of work to simplify this. But at FreedomFi, when we were working to do like the first deployment using the BioCell's radios, like the first CBRS network, it took us 3-4 days of people that relatively knew what they were doing to bring up one site, right? And then you can kind of maybe do a site every 2 hours. But the complexity was always there. And I remember distinctly, like Jesse and I were actually visiting a WISP and deploying CBRS.
What's a WISP?
Wireless ISP. So it's like basically a wireless internet service provider, company that gives you access to the internet, not through the wire, but through a wireless connection of sorts. It can be point-to-point Wi-Fi, or it can be 5G or LTE, or there is proprietary solutions for this. The general term in the industry for that is WISP. So I remember we were basically with Jesse doing this install at the WISP. Probably took like a couple of days to bring up 5 towers or something like that. And like Jesse was there and he knew what he was doing. And the other guy also was super brilliant. And then we went for dinner together. And I already at that point had like a Helium miner. And I'm like telling Jesse, what do you think? Like, do you think that we can actually like at some point get it to the point where like we could deploy a tower like that only with a degree of simplicity that the Helium OG miner comes online? And he's like, oh yeah, that's pretty fucking crazy. Like, I don't know. Yeah, that's, we can try to simplify it, but it sounds pretty crazy. And like to think about like actually how far we have come from that point to today, I think is pretty amazing. We still have a long way to go, but I think that we're making pretty good progress.
Awesome.
Yes.
Steven.
Yeah, so amazing points up here, and I think we've kind of all discussed this. This complexity of getting it to, for anyone to be able to deploy is something we have to overcome as an ecosystem. Like if you've checked out some of the live demos here, the indoor devices, the outdoor ones had these complexities with governance and having the CPI requirement, the SaaS requirement. All of that should be transparent. And I think that we're doing a good job building these products for indoor that are plug and play. I mean, the seamlessness, it's basically like Wi-Fi is today. When people buy routers from Best Buy, for example, anyone can do it. Your mom, your grandmother, your grandfather, whoever, they can go do it. You plug in the cable and it just works. And we want to continue to make that the case. So it's not just, we have to step out of the technicalities and really make it user-friendly. So app-driven. Something that's simple. You click the button, you have the instructions, and I think we're starting to make those strides. One of the challenges will be with this outdoor device. We all want coverage, and that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight from the typical MNOs, the big network operators, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, right? They have these huge sites that have really complex, big towers, and have this complexity of installation. But even with small cells now, those guys have challenges deploying those outdoors because there's site acquisition challenges. You can't just go and install it on the street corner without talking to the city and getting permission, whoever might own that pole, for example. So we're solving a problem here where anyone can take their property and make it an access point for 5G. So this community and what we're doing here will help distribute and enable people to take control of their network instead of relying on these other guys to go and get permission to do it, because you have permission, you own your property, you can run this network. So I think those are the...
Actually, this is a good segue, because why don't you describe what it would be like to install a Moso Labs indoor unit to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So Freedom Fi, tremendous product, and simplicity they built into how this works. So the product today, I'll just give you an example of how this worked. When we installed this demo upstairs, these products were brand new out of the box, straight from our factories. And you took it out, you plugged it into your router, right? You plugged the gateway, the AGW, the little Freedom Fi box, into the router. And you just followed these simple instructions. You followed a couple of prompts, pushed the button, and it comes online. And then you take the 5G radio out of the box and you plug that into your gateway. And you wait a few minutes, and all the complexities we're talking about have been automated. It talks back to the SaaS system, gets the grant, the allocation of spectrum that you can use, and it comes online. It takes about 15 minutes. Anyone can do it.
15 minutes?
Yeah, about 15 minutes.
Compared to tower providers doing this, which would take
months. Probably, yeah.
So that's innovation already happening. That's amazing.
Absolutely. We have to get to that 15, maybe 30 minutes for that outdoor device. I think one of the challenges we'll continue to have is you have to get on the ladder, right? So that's a physical thing we'll have to figure out, but making that simpler is something we'll continue working towards.
Like, Jesse, what's the outdoor requirement? Because I know there's some regulatory-based requirements for outdoor CBRS.
So the outdoors will take a little bit longer because they're the ones that have to be that CPI certified. As I mentioned, there's a loophole you can get around that with the indoors, but the outdoor will just take a little longer. It's just more of the physicalness of it. So there's not much for, there's very few spots within the US where there's like an exclusion zone where you just can't simply install. But yeah, if it's outdoor.
Is there height requirements?
There's, I think, it's like for category A. For category B, which is going to be like these higher powered outdoor radios, I think they had to be like over 15 feet or so, or 10
So there's a
feet or
category
something.
A.
Yeah, there's different categories.
Category B.
But I think that will be part of like
Based
the
on power.
provisioning. Yes. So during the provisioning process, I know they'll have like the requirements and everything there. But yeah, outdoor obviously is just going to take longer to install and properly mount and ground it and all that. So there's for anyone that hasn't done outdoor installs, there's probably a learning curve there. But yeah.
Okay.
If I may add, I think something that, having worked in telecom space for so long, it's something that, to me, that got me very excited about Helium and what Freedom 5 folks were doing. Because just to simplify, it's at the end of the day, mobile networks, a lot of data centers, towers that we talked about, and I think I'm really quoting here what Boris said, I think, at some point, at least in the past, is think of the whole network. Those are a bunch of software components, very complicated. They have like very weird words like MME, AGW, SGW, all those weird stuff. They've standardized here for standardization. Putting all that in one box, and that's what's being delivered right now with those gateways. You have the whole network that they're being built inside a single box. That's just transformative in terms of how they essentially deploy network at the edge. Now you add Helium on top of it, and an incentive mechanism where now operators are not owning the network. Now it's owned by you and you're part of this people network. It's just going to reshape the whole telecom industry. And just I think originally also from Africa, this is very personal to me because at the end of the day, about 40% of the world today are not connected to the internet. So when we talk about inclusive today, it's very hard. It's the same data cost is not the same in India as in the US. This is going to change the industry in ways that we never thought about. And it starts today in the US, but it's just going to move into other countries in the future.
Yeah, that's important actually, because I think everything we've talked about now is US-based, United States of America-based laws and regulations. We haven't even touched on Canada, Mexico, and our friends online from Europe and Asia, and Africa, and South America. How do we do this? Because I know it took a long time to get to the United States having unlicensed open spectrum. How do we pursue this in other countries? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I can start and probably gentlemen. I think to me, it really starts with CBRS, right? I don't want to get political, but something that I'm very thankful of the Trump administration is really this whole CBRS thing. Share spectrum, right? You don't have to pay billions of dollars to get licensed. That completely changed the whole industry in ways we not thought about. And today, other countries like in Germany, they're thinking about, there's a model happening there. In Africa, if you go to Nigeria for it today, there are companies that paid hundreds of millions just to get a license for 5G. Governments, this is a way to generate income today by licensing. When you talk about a free license where they're not making any money, this is where the starting point, right? How to convince them, hey, you can allocate spectrum. Let's use the language we use in the US. It's an innovation spectrum, right? Because this helps us to close the digital divide. This is going to help grow your GDP. Because when the farmer in Uganda is able to connect his devices at the farm, or even this farmer somewhere in Arkansas now is able to compete because his farm is connected, it changes society, right? And I think the starting point is really having this conversation with governments, being able to open up the spectrum and saying, hey, look at all those waves that are happening. Open source. Now you can have a full network operating system inside a box. You have eSIM. You don't have to physically make physical SIMs. This is, and I think blockchain is that fourth tidal wave, right? Because now you're shifting the economics, right? Now people can have, you can imagine someone in a village, that's my dream, someone in a village in their hut, they might have actually a Freedom 5 gateway and an antenna, and they're building this 5G network that they can't today do because it takes billions of dollars, and operators need to justify those ROIs. I mean, they're very sophisticated. They don't even talk about ROI. They talk about NPVs. So in terms of how to return that money they've invested in, that's why it slowed down the deployment of 5G network. I mean, in my country right now, it's a little country called Mauritania. They just deployed 4G. When you talk about 5G, like, what are you talking about? Right, so, yeah.
Yeah, I'll say something here too. I think globally, the solution, right, it's this balance of the spectrum we're talking about, maybe an innovation ban, pseudo-license ban like CBRS is, where you have this open, anyone can use it, but you also have priority ban, licensed spectrum part. But globally, it'll take a long time to get there. Like if we say there's a global shared band, that's going to take a long time. It's going to be a hybrid solution. We're going to have to put Wi-Fi as part of this mobile solution. You've seen this hybrid network be successful in Japan, for example. There's a recent success story there with Rakuten, who's deploying this hybrid network, which is this open source, software-driven RAN solution. So that's a radio access network solution. It has all this complexity, but it's software, and it's distributed, and it's hybrid. So I think we can kind of look at that and say, globally, I know I can deploy Wi-Fi. How do I get it to all the countries, whether it's Africa or Asia or Europe, South America, wherever? That's, I think, how we accelerate without having to go through all these governmental hurdles.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that basically somewhat maybe echoing what everybody else said, but generally we are like moving from this world where all of the wireless communication was in the like licensed spectrum bands. And before Wi-Fi, we didn't have Wi-Fi. Like basically, over time, like Wi-Fi first introduced, 2.4 gigahertz unlicensed band, and there's a lot of innovation. And this kind of like continued to progress more and more and more. And if you look at just the aggregate space in terms of like spectrum, if you can think of spectrum as like this highway that enables you to transmit information, the space started with like most of the spectrum being licensed, and over time it's moving more and more and more in bigger and bigger like bands, basically being opened up for either completely unlicensed use or like shared licensed use like we see with CBRS. So with Wi-Fi, we at Freedom Fight particularly very excited about, for example, Wi-Fi 6E, which really is going to come online, I think, like in mass next year. But Wi-Fi 6E is going to give you like 1.2 gigahertz of extra capacity. So like 150 megahertz is what you get with CBRS. So with Wi-Fi 6E, you get 10x the capacity. It won't go as far, but it's brand new band. It's also going to be coordinated for minimizing interference kind of in a central way, similar to CBRS. And it's a huge amount of capacity. And all of this is happening. I think like it creates the market, it creates the space for plays like Helium 5G to create these like community bottoms-up created networks.
It's great. I know we're out of time, but do we have time for questions, if there's questions? Because it's fascinating. So I'll just kind of call out, are there questions in the audience? Yeah, there's a couple, so let's get you guys your questions in.
Thanks for answering a lot of these questions. What are people doing with local municipalities? Because I see that looking around, trying to find locations that some of the local governments by me are charging $250 to $1,500 for an antenna license. And so is there a waiver on the CBRS for that? Or, because it doesn't make any difference as far as tower height or power, it's just antenna.
So I think that if I understand the question correctly, like if you are a telco and you want to deploy in some city, you have to go to the city and you have to like agree with the city on like where you're allowed to put up your infrastructure, your antennas and all the stuff. And it's always a negotiation process, and the city will get something out of it. The Helium model is the one where like you don't have that problem at all. Because instead of going and dealing with a city, you have somebody who already has a certain vertical asset or a street sign or a vending machine who can, because now it's simplified to this point, just take Freedom Fight Gateway, take a BioCells or MosaLab small cell, plug it in, and become part of this bigger network. So this whole question of dealing with municipalities kind of like goes away altogether.
No, it doesn't, because it's not about getting approved by the city. It's just literally getting a little permit or a license.
So for CBRS, for like Cat B devices, which is the outdoor devices, the license is this CPI certification, effectively, that Jesse was telling about. So there's certain regulations that the antenna has to be 20 feet above ground, that like it has to be the radio that is FCC certified CBRS radio.
So for instance, like if I want to put a vending machine in, even though vending machines are legal, I still have to pay a $35 fee to the city. you know,
So it sounds like this is a local
right, but
kind of
but it's
specific
many
question,
local
yeah.
areas.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. Like when you're talking about this, are you saying you're going to install it in a public place or a property that you own outright?
I mean, typically they would consider it any commercial application,
Okay.
so, which it
Yeah.
would fall under.
Yeah, it's a good.
I'm just wondering if anybody else is, and if,
Yeah.
is it giving like, and will these cells be available like on a ledger again somewhere where they can see where they're at, so?
So
Can't
all of
really
the
hide it.
cells,
Yeah.
there's a central database of all of the cells, and they all get centrally granted the right to broadcast.
Okay.
As far as the specific permits, you know, I'm not sure if I have a good answer for the specific case in this particular city, but generally speaking, like, if you own the piece of real estate, or maybe you have a contract with the city, like, it's like, you don't. The dynamic is very different when you're solving this problem in the bottoms-up fashion versus the tops-down fashion, like a telco coming into the city and negotiating for the right to put their infrastructure, or in that city, like I can have a house in the downtown, for instance. Like downtown Palo Alto, there's a bunch of still private buildings, and it's a private building. And if it's my building, I can put the CBRS Cat B device on top of my roof, and there's nothing that the city can do.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, there's a question right here. Yep, no, it's the guy right there. Yeah, standing up.
Yeah, mine's way more basic.
Sorry, their mic's coming.
Yeah, mine's way more basic. So, so 5G. So this Helium network and these small antennas on all the domestic houses, etc. That's going to be the way that 5G networks sort of get transmitted, is it? Because rather than having the big towers, is that kind of the crux of it? I'm not a technical guy, so forgive me if it's a dumb question. I'll take the mantle of being the dumbest guy in the room from you, Frank.
Take that, Jesse.
Frank, that's a question for you.
I can take it, Jesse.
Jesse,
So, no, so this is a CBRS radios we're selling, right? So it's what's classified or categorized as a small cell. So it's like a lower powered device. That's not to say you couldn't install it in like a macro fashion, like put them up on a really tall tower. But the bulk of the radios, yeah, most likely is going to be in a smaller footprint type setting. And a big part of that too is just the characteristics of the band. So it's, again, much more lower power. So there's actually like a power limit and cap on CBRS. So you can't do like 20, 40 watts. Like a lot of the macro cells are going to be, these are like 1 watt radios. So yeah, you can do that, but you're not going to get the 10 miles coverage.
Yep.
So yeah, the bulk of this network is definitely going to be built in a more small cell, in smaller footprint coverages.
So thank you so much for being here on this panel. Really interesting topic. If you have more questions, we'll be in the back. Feel free to ask us. Or join our Discord group if you haven't, especially online. If you didn't know and you're watching from YouTube, please do join our community, discord.gg/helium. There are channels that just go into great depths about how to deploy 5G in your city. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.